Hello world, welcome to the Casual Historian Podcast. My name is Grant, and with me I have my co-host James Varble.
Hello world.
So this is the podcast where my friend and I, two history buffs, talk history and the things we don't usually get to talk about in a regular history class. Things that you're not going to find, or if you do find it, you're not going to have the chance to talk about the things you want because an instructor has an agenda to make you learn things.
Well, you're not far off on that. Instructors are often required to cover large amounts of information in a short amount of time, so they're often forced to focus on big picture stuff and they leave out the details. Well, the trouble is, you sometimes miss crucial context. History is not just learning facts about the past, you're learning about things that shaped the lives of people. History is the story of dreams, aspirations, attempts, triumphs, and failures about people. And when you look at it in that respect, it becomes a lot more interesting.
Yes, definitely. And that is exactly the way every department head I've talked to at my university has described it. Anyway, so this is going to be our chance to talk about all the things we want to talk about that we don't get to do in a regular history class. And so today's topic is what's our historical backgrounds, what made us love history, because this is our inaugural podcast, so I'm thinking the audience should know something about us. So I guess let's start with you. What made you interested in history? Like, was it reading? Was it a show? Was it something that triggered your historicaliness?
Well, as you put it, my historicaliness was triggered mostly because I did in fact love to read as a child. I also loved those old school Hollywood epic movies. So I'm a child of the mid 80s, and I didn't really get to experience as a child the current, heavily CGI'd epics. So I was watching things like Ben-Hur and Spartacus, movies from the 60s, and while looking back on them, they're horribly campy. You can hear the plastic clanks of swords against each other. They present historical atmospheres and situations, as we now know, somewhat inaccurately, but they do create this mysterious and mystical quality about history that I fell in love with. So being a reader, looking at these things, and also my weird love of maps. Because one of the other things about being a child of the 80s is growing up in the 1990s, and every other year, the atlas has changed, because borders are constantly being revised every other year in the 90s, especially in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union. So, I'm like, why is this happening? What's going on here? And that began my fixation with history, and especially European history, because, the cradle of Western civilization is contained in, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And, also my other interests helped intersect with it. I love literature, I love music, and learning about history provided crucial context. You don't understand why Beethoven writes his Third Symphony and dedicates it to Napoleon unless you know something about Napoleon. And you definitely don't understand why Beethoven retracts his dedication to Napoleon without knowing something about Napoleon.
Yeah, so I guess for myself, I wish I knew exactly what the trigger was. Like, I remember a few years ago, I was looking through a box that my mom keeps. And my mom keeps for my brother and I these two boxes full of things from when we were younger. Projects we did from, like, grade school and whatnot. And I remember for third grade, my third grade teacher, which I was in a private school at that time, so yeah, something of a different experience, but she kept a mini journal for all of her students for what they did during that week. Little things, ups and downs the student had during the week. And one of the things I came across was this is 9-year-old me that saying, during our social studies class, we were looking at the conquistadors, and Grant would always say, hey, listen to me, I have the right answer on this. And at first, people didn't listen to me. And then when they found out I did have the right answer, they started listening to me. So the earliest example I have of being a history know-it-all is, being a know-it-all in third grade with, I have the right answers, listen to me. Earliest solid context for something, me being a history guy, was maps. Just like you, I loved maps, but in particular, I loved the board game Risk. And
Risk.
Yes.
You are not a history nerd if you've not enjoyed a game of Risk.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. And I would play Risk a lot, and I would always try to expand on the rules to make it more interesting. And little did I know that when I was like in middle school, I was actually just turning Risk into Axis and Allies. I didn't know that then, but I would love to play Risk, and I would often like by high school, I was making my own risk boards because the standard 42 territory, 6 continents just got a little bored. You know what I mean? Got a little boring. You can only, he who controls Australia can control the world so many times.
The point you make about risk in gaming is very interesting too, because, for better or worse, war does shape a big part of history. And, risk in its variance is also linked to me as well, because I remember growing up, one of the earliest risk variants was called castle risk. Because any historian or political or military nerd who plays regular risk starts pulling their hair out because you're randomly assigned territories and you're just like, okay, everything is non-contiguous and I have no capital, I have no base. Castle risk was one where, it's set primarily in Europe, but you had a capital and you had to defend it. So it began introducing the sense of dimension and, the idea of great power rivalry that, I would eventually come to be obsessed with.
That, I think that we find, at least with people our age, that's going to be a commonality for history buffs, is they loved Risk or other related games. And in high school, of course, I eventually got into Axis and Allies and realized, oh, this is what I was trying to turn Risk into. There's less flexibility in terms of historical scenarios you could play with Axis and Allies, but it gave you a deeper context of an actual history.
And similar for me, another game developed by Avalon Hill, which is responsible for Axis and Allies, is Diplomacy, which is, less about dice rolling and hardcore gaming in that respect, and all about the interpersonal interactions as you roleplay a country in pre-World War I Europe. And easy variants on that actually can push the game back as far as the Napoleonic Wars, if you do it right. So, I think that's one of the things about history, is that for those of us who understand and appreciate history, it actually can serve to enhance your understanding and appreciation of literally anything else. There is not a discipline or academic field or fandom even that doesn't benefit from knowing history. Obviously, politics, economics, you benefit from knowing history. But music, art, literature, science, medicine, everything is better with history. It's kind of like bacon.
Kind of, except we haven't overhyped history to the point where everyone starts to hate it.
All the hype is justified with bacon, Grant. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you're talking about avocado, Grant.
I'm born and raised in California. I have the right to have avocado on anything I want.
But anyway, back to history, and we won't talk about the history of avocados and obsession with it, because I'm really not up on culinary history, but that is a thing. And we actually might at some point talk about the history of the Napoleon or the croissant, because pastries are surprisingly rife with historical significance.
Oh yeah, especially in Mexico when, you mess with a French baker and France decides to invade you.
Or the fact that the things that we commonly take for granted in our baked goods, like salt or sugar, or spices like ginger or cinnamon, are things that literally caused wars.
Yes, people like to think, oh, we go to war for such transient reason nowadays. No, I think they're actually more significant nowadays than before. But then again, you're trying in the past to cover up rotting meat with spices because you paid a lot of money for that meat.
And also because agriculture had not progressed to the point where spices could be developed in, outside of their native climates, which meant that they were very costly and expensive. So in that respect, war as an aspect of profiteering or trying to control valuable resources hasn't changed. All that has changed is what the resources are.
These are all the many reasons history, you should learn it regardless of what you're specializing in. It makes everything richer. I think the only thing that isn't made richer by history is possibly the Doctor Who fandom. That's mostly because they have no rules for that show.
Please don't piss off half the internet in our first podcast.
The other question I think we need to be asking is that, where do you get your history knowledge from? I know, when I talked history a lot of times to around people who are not history buffs, the question they always want to ask is, where do you get your information? It's like how do you know so much? All that stuff you might be asked at different points by people who are less knowledgeable or less academic minded. So I guess, where did you start learning all of your history? Was it just from books, or did you have other sources?
Well, first off, I would strongly say reading is the foremost method of obtaining knowledge in history. The only question, of course, is what to read. I can tell you that you should probably not pay attention to the average high school or college survey course textbook. I'm not going to say that because, it's not that I'm saying that they're full of inaccuracies. It's that, again, they're trying to compress large amounts of information over a large period into one volume. So there's a lot that's going to be left out. There's a lot of context that's going to be missed. When I was young, though, we had a set of Encyclopedia Britannicas at home. And so I was lucky in, before the internet had become the mainstay it is today, that I had them. Because if there was anything that I needed to look up or find, I could find some reference to it in that, and I would read it. And I learned very early on to make use of bibliographies. That if there was something that I wanted to know more about that wasn't contained in those books, I would go look for it at the library. I was probably the youngest person ever to exploit my local library's interlibrary loan system, because if they didn't have it, I was determined to find it. And then, of course, as the internet age really dawned upon us, finding articles, PDFs of historical texts, anyone can tell you the value of primary sources in history. Not necessarily everyone can tell you that you have to take them a bit with a grain of salt. There's a saying that I really like, which is, when it comes to history, no era is more remote than the immediate past. And that's very true. But, also finding good documentary series to watch has definitely helped, because sometimes the well-produced ones can provide a certain human element. Books are definitely good at getting the logos of something down. Sometimes the pathos or the ethos is lacking, and documentaries can really help with that. And then finally, the other thing that really helped me was I had really good history instructors when I was in high school who were not chained to the history books. And it was before Common Core as well, so there was a bit more flexibility, and they encouraged open discussion in classes and wanted to encourage students to be interested in what was going on.
For me, reading has definitely become the primary way of getting more historical knowledge now, but I have to say, I'm kind of a little ashamed to say this because I am a history major now, taking a graduate level course at my university, but I think the first time I ever actually looked at a bibliography wasn't until like a couple years ago. I made the faulty assumption that, someone took the time to put it down in a book, and an editor must have went through it, so it must be right. And so that's something that's a little embarrassing to admit, but I'd say the earliest form of my historical intake, it wasn't books, unfortunately. It's like, I didn't really solidify that my love for a thing was history until I was about maybe 13, 14. Because before then, like when I loved Risk, my thought was, I like war, I like action, I like combat. So that must be what I like. And the rest of this stuff is just dressing around it. And so I'd have to say that my info for history came from the History Channel. This was...
Back then, the History Channel actually had quality historical programming.
It did, though.
And it wasn't just World War II, Vietnam 24/7.
Yes, but what got me starting watching the History Channel wasn't regular history, but rather I really liked Arthurian legend, and so I watched the bunch of specials that History Channel came out with about King Arthur around 2004 when the last King Arthur movie came out. The one I think that's based on Gildas, the one they tried to make a Roman King Arthur.
The one with, was it Clive Owen playing King Arthur, or
I can't say at the top of my head. It's like
the one from the mid 2000s.
It was 2004. It was one of the films that's actually available for my class, but that's not relevant here. But basically, that film came out. That got me really interested in King Arthur. And then you find the somewhat of a historical context for King Arthur. But that was where I started. And then I eventually got more into books. So I guess my pattern was sort of the inverse of yours, where you started with books and eventually got to some film series. I started with television and TV and moved into books.
Well, I should point out, and hearing you mention the History Channel does remind me of this. When I was young, in the mid-90s, the Learning Channel actually was about learning. And there was this really interesting series I remember watching with my family called Great Castles of Europe that they put on. And they would take historically significant castles. One that definitely stands out to me is Edinburgh Castle. And what they would do is they would look at the castle, and rather than, presenting the entire history of the castle, they would focus on significant events in which the castle played a pivotal role. So, for example, with Edinburgh, the episode focused on the rivalry between Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth, and the eventual accession of James I, which is significant because that's, that lays the foundation for the modern United Kingdom. But, it was something in that respect because I also love castles. They look cool. You look at them and, if you're expecting castles to always look like, the centerpiece of Disneyland, you may be disappointed. But when you look at an actual castle and being able to travel and see a few, you just have this utter sense of the history of the place, the events that took place here. And that's something else too. I mean, in the United States, we don't really have that many places like this. We don't have, as a country, significant locations like that have been around for millennia, outside of a few native sites. Going to Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, where places are literally drenched in thousands of years of human experience is profound. And, that's probably why, documentary series are great, because you get at least a glimpse of that to an extent.
One of the other big reasons I watched a lot of History Channel and got really into it through documentaries was largely because History Channel started coming out with these the Barbarians documentary series they had, and a lot of it. Yeah, and a lot of that for me was, back then I wanted to be a fantasy writer. I wanted to write the next great fantasy epic, and I thought, look at these things. These things are about castles and knights and stuff, and that's what's in fantasy. I'll just watch this and try to get inspiration for that. I have not become the next great fantasy writer, but I've become the next possibly future unemployed history student.
Something else is, you mentioning fantasy is that, especially for me as well, a fantasy fan, I grew up knowing Lord of the Rings. You mentioned Arthurian legends. I was raised on Arthurian legends and the Chanson de Roland, about Charlemagne's knights. But, another two big fandoms of mine that are kind of opposed in some ways, Star Wars and Star Trek. Star Wars because, it's a galaxy far, far away, but when you look at it, it's very easy to see kind of parallels in history. The rise of the Empire, Palpatine becoming emperor, and I think we've had this argument between us. Is it more like Julius Caesar laying the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire for Augustus, or is it more Napoleon, or is it Hitler coming to power in Germany? And of course, Lucas may say one thing or another on it, but I think by this point fans kind of look politely at George when he talks and say, that's nice, don't talk anymore, and don't make any more movies. Whereas Star Trek, though, presents an interesting quandary because, beginning of the 1960s, where they had expectations for the future of humanity as early as the 1990s and onward, which we have not necessarily met, some of which are sad, some of which are probably better. I mean, we're supposed to be about at World War III by now, according to Star Trek, and I think I'm okay that we have not reached that yet. But, that also leads to something else. When you begin to immerse yourself in history, and you're also a big fan of literature, especially in the realms of sci-fi and fantasy and time travel and you start thinking about alternate timelines or how history could have been different, or what is the trigger for the butterfly effect that changes history in a certain way. And so history and appreciation of it, what I would say to people is really a matter of perspective. If you're looking at it as just facts and rote, yes, indeed, it's going to be boring. But when you look at it as stories and epics, and, as Han Solo has said, it's all true, that creates this sense of interest to it. Because, you have passion, you have love, you have ambition, you have desire, you have the backstabbing and the epic battles, but unlike Lord of the Rings, unlike Star Wars, unlike any other fictional fandom, in history, they're real, they took place, and they shaped the world we now live in.
Yes, the fantasy has definitely it was one of the drivers. So I guess I didn't know the whole time I was growing up that I was going towards being a lover of history and wanting to be a professional in some way with it. But I had all these other little areas pushing me towards that eventual realization. Now, Mike, I think you'd want to do something similar. You want to be a professional historian in some capacity, whether it be teaching or writing or some kind of project involving history, so you have an outlet for all this stuff you've spent time acquiring, all this knowledge.
It's one of those things, I'm impressed with us that we've gone this far without mentioning this axiom, but I'm going to do so now. The old axiom that those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it is true, but it's not so much doomsaying thing per se, but there's a simple reality that if you want to understand the world as it is today. You want to look around and you want to understand, why are things the way they are? Why are things in some ways bad? Why are things in some ways good? You need a historical formation to understand that. And you also need really a historical formation to be able to project a way forward. And of course, there may be disagreements about the way we interpret history or the impact that certain things have had, but that's by far a better conversation than, arguments from ignorance kind of talking into the void of the present. Because if you take the present day out of context, you're really just screaming into a void.
Yes, I too am impressed that we haven't gone immediately to the axioms, though I have held for some time that my philosophy of history comes from Mark Twain, or at least this quote is attributed to Mark Twain, in that history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme a lot.
Well, and of course, going back to what we talked about earlier, where history is a reflection of human behavior, it is kind of, on one hand, relieving, on the other hand, unsettling to know that human nature really hasn't changed that much over the 6 or so millennia of recorded history.
All right, well, I think that's actually going to wrap up this episode, unless there's something else you want to bring up.
I think that in just an elementary discussion or introduction, we've kind of thrown a lot out there. And I really hope that listeners will come back as we tackle more substantive topics in greater detail, and I hope that you have enjoyed this.
All right, then. This has been the Casual Historian Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then give us a rating and a review on iTunes. You can also find this podcast on the Casual Historian YouTube channel. And you can follow the Casual Historian on Facebook and Twitter. And go to casualhistorian.com for more content like this. You can email any comments, questions, or business inquiries to casualhistorian@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.